What unites women in their struggle for public power from ancient history until today? Mary Beard is here to discuss that question and her new book, Women and Power, a Manifesto. How did comic strips and graphic novels go from being underground sensations to full-blown literary respect? Hillary Chute is here to talk about her new book, Why Comics? From Underground to Everywhere. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm John Williams.
Mary Beard joins us now to talk about her latest book, Women and Power, a Manifesto. She is, of course, also the author, most recently, of SPQR and many other books. And I don't know, are you the greatest living classicist, at least in England?
I think some of my colleagues might question that.
All right, well, we'll say it here. So, Mary, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here.
So this is a very different book from you. For one thing, it's not directly a book of the classics or about the classics, and very different from your book of, was it last year that SPQR came out?
Yeah, just the year before, yeah.
Okay. So what's the story behind this book, which is a slim book and has the very intriguing subtitle, A Manifesto?
The story is I gave 2 lectures several years apart, actually, at the British Museum about women's voices in the public sphere and also how powerful women were represented in the public sphere. And in doing those lectures, what I really wanted to do was not talk about the ancient world, but to try to show how the ways women were presented within classical literature and art were still part of the way that provided the template, really, for the way we understood women's roles, power, sound, even now.
And what was the impetus for that first lecture, which was called The Public Voice of Women?
The impetus was really a very good editor, because as often I think literary editors know what you want to say before you quite know it yourself. Mm-hmm. And Mary Kay Wilmers, who's the editor of the London Review of Books, sponsoring this lecture, said, "You'll do the lecture, won't you?" And I said, "Sure, I will." And eventually I said, "What am I going to talk about?" And she said, "Well, why don't you talk about women's voices?" And, in that way, that somehow something then clicked. I thought, that is actually what I want to talk about. And, I want to start and think about how the way we hear the voices of women are both extremely different from how we hear the voices of men, but how there's a really long history to that hearing, right back to Homer.
Right. And you start with Homer as the first recorded instance of a man telling a woman to shut up. For those who don't necessarily think of Homer in this way or immediately know what this anecdote is, tell us.
It's the very beginning of the Odyssey. Odysseus is still trying to come home, Greek hero trying to come home from the Trojan War, back to his long-suffering wife, Penelope, who's been waiting for him in the palace at Ithaca with their son, Telemachus. And she's a very savvy middle-aged woman. One day she goes downstairs from her room and she hears a bard singing in the palace. And he's singing about what a terrible, difficult time the heroes are having trying to get home from Troy. It's a very miserable song. And she says, quite reasonably, "Couldn't you find a more cheerful song to sing?" And then this teenager, Telemachus, comes over to his mum and says, "Shut up, mother. Speech is man's business. Go back to your room." And off she goes.
And that's how it all began.
And that's how it all began. And I think it's even worse than my retelling of it makes it seem, because it's not just that Telemachus is a rather unpleasant guy. It's that the whole poem is partly about Telemachus growing up, and the first moment that we see Telemachus learning to be a man is showing that he can shut his mum up. So it's showing us and reminding us, I think, that the silencing of women and the voice of men are actually built into the definition of what it is to be a bloke.
It's interesting because this is true of many works, not just Homer, but you think about young women coming to these today, maybe hopefully growing up in somewhat changed times and circumstances in which they don't necessarily think of themselves as being forced to be quiet, then coming across these works, which are heralded works, which were saying, you should read this, you should read this. I mean, as a classicist, is your message to those girls, yes, read this, but also understand this context?
I don't think that we read classical literature in order to have a model for our own conduct.
Right, right. Things would really look terrible if that were true.
I think that happily, things have changed since the 8th century BC. We're here for a start.
Right.
Talking together.
No one's told us to shut up yet.
Yeah, but I don't think there is a woman on the planet who hasn't got some occasion in their head where they knew that they had either been shut up or actually in some ways not been listened to because they were a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And that there is still a sense that when women talk, they don't carry there are some exceptions, obviously, but generally they don't carry that kind of voice of authority. And so we all know in the UK that, when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, one of the first things she did was to take voice training lessons so that she sounded deep and profound, not like a high-pitched woman who no one would listen to.
Right.
And I think, on the one hand, it's nice that we can say, oh, look, that doesn't affect us anymore. And in most of my day-to-day life, it doesn't. But, I've got, etched in my heart, I've got those occasions when people just didn't listen to me because I'm a woman.
So, okay, I want to date precisely these two lectures. The Public Voice of Women was one and Women in Power is the other. When did you give these lectures?
I believe that the first one was in 2014. And then I kind of gave this reprise of taking a slightly different topic in 2017.
Obviously, you understand the past very well, but it feels like you knew the future, too, when giving that speech because of, and from across the ocean, because of what's been going on here in America in 2017.
This feels I feel slightly uncomfortable saying this because they were more prophetic, or particularly the 2017 lecture was more prophetic than I could ever have imagined, partly in terms of the idea of, in the UK, how Theresa May is treated. At one point I say, and I felt slightly anxious about this, women are sometimes put in power in order to fail. And we do wonder whether that's the case with Theresa May. And I think, we still have to wait to see. But in general, a combination of the two lectures, I think, was strangely prophetic and quite unwittingly so of the way women are beginning to speak out about all kinds of things, particularly in the last few months since I sent the manuscript off.
So some of our listeners here, we have international listeners, of course, but here we think of people like Maxine Waters, and other people sort of not being necessarily listened to or allowed to speak. Theresa May, give us some examples for those of us who aren't aware of how she was treated when speaking out.
I think it's slightly different, and it's not kind of like the Elizabeth Warren moment.
Yeah.
But there is a sense in which this is the use of the woman as a fall guy for the men. Mm-hmm. That she's not unlistened to. I think that wouldn't be fair. But as you watch the men of the Tory party circling around Theresa May, waiting for their moment, not taking it now because they want her to fail. They're in the middle of the most difficult and fruitless set of negotiations the UK has gone into in the last 100 years. There is no good outcome. And it's very convenient for those blokes.
I mean, one thing that's troubling is that at the same time that you have women rising to the highest levels of power, you have them coming into institutions that are fundamentally struggling, whether it's in journalism or in media or in Hollywood or in parts of the tech industry, and of course in the government at a very troubling time, certainly in the UK in the wake of Brexit, that it almost seems like diabolical that the circumstances are such that it's very hard for them.
Yes, it's very hard.
And
also, I think, as a horrible rule of thumb, looking round at the different places that women found they could rise to the top, it has, come to seem to me that, as I say, as a basic rule of thumb, the more women there are at the top of any organisation, the more trouble that organisation is in.
It's like a terrible,
or the less prestige it has. As soon as an institution has prestige, as soon as it's flourishing, who's there at the top? It's the guys.
So you gave this lecture, this first one, in 2014, The Public Voice of Women. What was the reception like? And then why did you feel the need then to follow up with another lecture in 2017?
The reception was, well, I was very touched by it because in some ways, all women, I think, wonder and worry about how their voice is sounding. But you tend to talk about it to your girlfriends, and I'd spent ages talking about academic seminars, and how the men seem to dominate it, and as soon as any woman made a really good point, there was suddenly kind of a few seconds of silence, and some man would say, now, as I was saying, and this was kind of very popular academic women's talk, and I think, anybody who works in a university will instantly recognise that. What was fun, and I think both totally dispiriting and wonderfully cheering at the same time, was that this clearly spoke to women in all kinds of professions that I knew nothing of.
It wasn't just the professors who were suffering.
That's right. It wasn't just us. And in some ways that made you feel a lot better. But I got all kinds of emails from women in the media who had been told to go off and lower their voices so they sounded like guys. I got, and I suppose this was inevitable, but I'd not really considered it enough, women barristers and lawyers saying, look, we live in a world in which, in the courtroom, speech counts for so much, and we can see that we are not carrying that clout that our male colleagues are. So there was a kind of bonding, a few months of tremendous bonding, and people were I think, quite excited, all of us, to find out that this was not something that we were kind of suffering alone, but it went right through culture.
So you mentioned emails, which brings us to sort of all kinds of electronic forms of communication. And let's talk about your trolls.
Yeah, well, I've had, more than my fair share of trolls.
Were they in response to this?
They were not in response to this. They were in response to largely appearances on the radio, television. The worst one, I think, was in response to my claim that there were some benefits to immigration into the United Kingdom. Not a fashionable view, I have to say. And I got the absolutely traditional range of these, from death threats to, I will put this delicately, but your private parts smell like cabbage. You are a filthy old smelly slut. All this kind of
deeply original
thoughts. Written, I think, largely by guys with nothing better to do very late at night, on their laptops in their mum's attic, probably. And to start with, I took the advice that was given to me, which was block them. Most of these came on Twitter. Block them and don't reply.
Right, ignore them.
Because otherwise you're feeding the trolls, you're giving them the oxygen and publicity that they want. And after a kind of day or so, I thought, look, women have been told whenever they're abused, again, right back to the Odyssey, to shut up, that shut up and put up, don't answer back. And, here is somebody, not only abusing me, but abusing me in a stupid way. I am going to answer back. I'm going to say, please, will you take that down, at the very least? And that proved for me hugely liberating. I think that any woman who's on Twitter has to find her own way of dealing with this, and I don't think that necessarily I would say that everybody had to follow my example, but the not to find myself silenced and not to feel that somehow what we're all doing is, looking at these load of bullies on Twitter and kind of leaving them in charge of the schoolyard.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because you can respond to them in a human way that treats them as human so that they see you as human and as individual. I'm wondering, though, if you found any limitation to that, because it doesn't work with everyone, right?
There's certainly limitations, and it would be naively optimistic to suggest that a nice little tweet back kind of had them running away with their tails between their legs, apologising. Right. But I mean, for me, I think death threats are that's a crime.
Right.
You know, you don't start to negotiate with someone who's threatening to cut your head off and rape it. You know, that is just not on. It is a crime, whatever form it comes into, and you have to go to the police. That's.
And did you?
Yeah, with death threats I did.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I found that, well, two things I think. One is that you have some success. You do have some
I want you
success.
to tell some of the success stories after, because they're great.
But even when you don't, one of the things that's happening is that other people are seeing you not being silenced.
Yeah.
You know? And I think that you have to think about, I don't mean this to sound remotely patronising about young women, but I think had I got this when I was in my early 20s, I would have been much more scared by it. And I think just to be in there and saying, look, excuse me, would you mind taking that down? I don't think that's really polite. There's a kind of sense in which you're showing that you can stand up to this.
What's interesting is that it all really does come down to power, right? So it's your power as a woman in responding, but that initial taunt from the trolls is a desperate grasp at maintaining power and exerting power by people who feel like the power is being taken away from them.
Yeah, it is. And I think most of them are sad, not bad. And I think the other thing that I came to realise is that although there were particular prompts to the trolling, in the end, it wasn't so much that they disagreed with what I was saying. They wanted to shut me up. They didn't want me to say anything.
Yeah.
And you scrutinise, what you've said and how you've argued until you realise that actually it's the woman's voice they don't want to hear. It's not what actually she thinks about migration or whatever.
It's not the content, but it's the fact that you're talking at all.
And they do things just like, you can trace this right back to Greco-Roman mythology. They'll say, I'm going to come round and cut your tongue out. Well, that says it all, really.
Tell us a story about one of the trolls. And I don't want to give away the ending, but tell us a story of one of your trolls with a happy ending.
Well, my favourite story is the story of a young man who did something along the lines of your private parts smell like cabbage. And I, first of all, replied on Twitter and said, please take that down. Other people saw this and said, please take it down. Then somebody rather enterprisingly said, I think I know his mum. I'll ask her.
Whoa.
And in fact, this did seem to work. And the guy took it down. Whether mother had intervened, I don't know. And all seemed to be kind of okay. And I thought that was all right. He came to visit me in Cambridge, contrite and apologised, took me to lunch.
Wow. And what led him to do that?
Because I think... he'd been on holiday. He'd been with the lads. He'd probably been having a bit too much to drink, and it was all a bit of bravado. And, he wasn't a bad person. He just looked at what he'd done and thought, oh, help. And so it all looked as if there was going to be a happy ending until he went for a job. And when he went for a job, he was offered one job, and he was very pleased. And then he got an email to say, we've just Googled you. And we know exactly what you did to Mary Beard. And they would do the job offer. Now, I tried to write to them at that point and say, look, it's over. He apologised. Just do it. But no good. Then I decided, having talked to him again, that I would provide him with a recommendation. Because the only person who could say to any potential employer of this guy that he had apologised and that I had accepted his apology and that I regarded it as completely over, the only person who could say that was me.
Right.
And he got a job in the end. And so now there have been some ups and downs on
wow.
route, but now...
I mean, how did he respond when he found out that when you offered that to write a letter?
He was very, very grateful.
Yeah.
He still sends me little Christmas presents.
Oh.
Because, he was a young lad who had said something really horrible. But, not because that he was a deeply evil, wicked person, but because he was uninhibited on holiday, had too much to drink, and then suddenly found that he'd done something which wasn't going to go away.
How does your experience and training and all the writing you've done as a classicist, what perspective do you bring to this subject that, because this is something that is definitely in the air. Lots of people are writing about it, tweeting about it, blogging about it, etc.
Well, I think as often really, classics gives you a really interesting way into this, which is absolutely relevant but slightly removed. You see the issues very, very clearly if you look at Greek literature or Roman literature. When you look at the stories of rape and the mutilation of women in ancient literature, and happily, that is, it hasn't set exactly a template for the future,
Right.
but it shows you very, very acutely what lies at the base of some of the ways that women are talked about, talked to, put down and harassed and assaulted even now. I mean, I very much doubt that the guy, I assume it was a guy, who wrote to me saying, I'm going to cut your tongue out, would have known the story of Philomela, who in ancient mythology had her tongue cut out so she could not denounce her rapist. But it was an absolute mirror of that.
Can you leave us with one story from the ancients about women and power that you think is especially, if not a guide, or perhaps a warning or somehow enlightening?
I don't think I've got many encouraging stories. I don't think that you can go back to antiquity and find nice role models for the future. When you appear to find powerful women in antiquity, you know exactly what's going to happen to them next.
Punished.
Yes, so that they look powerful now, but that turn over 3 pages and they'll be dead. So I haven't got a kind of a woman that I can make a kind of badge for the future, but I think that if I look at those tragic heroines, the tragic heroines like Clytemnestra or Medea, all the others, who are going to come to a sticky end and who are not, as it were, role models for anybody, nasty, in many cases, magical witches and murderesses, nevertheless, even in the way that they're put down, there is a sense in all that there was some power in those women that necessitated that they should be. So see through the story, read the story against the grain, read it against the logic of the story, and you can't help but come up face to face with some sort of idea of the importance, the power, the inevitability of women's presence in the world.
Well, if we can't look to the classics for a role model, we can look to a classicist. Mary, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
The book, again, is called Women in Power, a Manifesto by Mary Beard. She is the author of many books, most recently the best-selling SPQR.
Hillary Chute's Why Comics From Underground to Everywhere, a sprawling history of comics, including graphic novels and other genres, is reviewed on our cover this week by the Times' film critic Manola Dargis. And Hillary joins me now from her office in Boston, where she teaches at Northeastern University. Hi, Hillary.
Hi.
Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So let's start by talking about your role at Northeastern before we get into the book, because I'm curious about where your sort of academic career and this book dovetail. You teach English and art and design, and how much do you teach around comics and graphic novels and those subjects?
So this is actually my first year at Northeastern. I was previously at the University of Chicago for many years and then at Harvard in between. And so one of the things that I have been doing at the various places where I have been teaching is I've been teaching these places first dedicated courses on the graphic novel, which is really exciting. So I did that at the University of Chicago in the English department. I did that at Harvard in the English department, and I am just wrapping up my course called the Graphic Novel, which is a fall semester course here at Northeastern that is cross-listed with English and art and design.
Has it been difficult to get these places interested in these courses, or is there an enthusiasm for it?
There is a real enthusiasm for it. I've been really excited to note, since I was a graduate student in the early 2000s, working on a dissertation about comics and wondering if I would ever possibly get a job, that academic institutions of all different sorts seem to be really interested in having courses on the curriculum about comics. And one of the things I've noticed is that the enthusiasm is coming from the ground, from students. So this is the kind of work that students are interested in studying when they're studying literature, for example, or interested in studying when they're studying contemporary art and design.
In our review of the book, Manohla Dargis, a Times film critic, notes that, as she puts it, you've untethered the book from linear history, and that allows you to sort of hop from idea to idea rather than tell it in a chronological narrative. Was that initially your idea, or as you started the project, because it is a very wide-ranging book, and it includes illustrations, it includes analysis, it includes, you've interviewed comics writers, and I'm just wondering how the structure of it took shape.
Well, I had previously published 3 academic books, and I decided I wanted to write a book for a wider audience because I was noticing that so many people were interested in comics. And so I wanted to write a book for a person who hadn't even necessarily read a single comics work before, but someone who might just be interested, and for people who are fans of comics. So my main goal was to do a book on comics that wasn't boring. So non-boringness was my main goal.
But that also sounds like a hard balance, because the people who are into it are really into it, and so they know so much that I figure you would fear that you're telling them things they already know.
Yes, but I figured if I came up with this structure, which was different than any other book that had been published about comics, that maybe I actually would be telling them something from a framework they hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, talk about that framework and the way you set up the book with these questions in each chapter.
The sort of central question of the book is, what can comics do differently from other media? And so I decided to structure the book, and this was my version of something that I thought was not boring, around what I think are the 10 biggest themes in contemporary comics. And I wanted to do them not necessarily chronologically, but they do sort of follow one from the other. So the themes are why disaster, why superheroes, why sex, why the suburbs, why cities, why punk, why illness and disability, why girls, why war, and why queer. Now, obviously, there are queer girls, and war is disaster, so they're not necessarily discrete.
Yeah.
But to me, they were discrete enough in terms of comics production and comics themes.
Let's pause for a second here, and I apologize if this is too late to pause, but let's describe what comics are, because I think for someone even like me who's fairly familiar and reads in some of these genres from time to time, this is a very broad category.
Yes. So my big line on comics, sort of one sentence takeaway here, is that, this sounds awkward, comics is a medium. So the cartoonist and comics theorist Scott McCloud, in his 1993 book, Understanding Comics, put forward that awkward syntax. Comics is a medium the way film is a medium. Mm-hmm. I've had a lot of editors thinking my writing is quite awkward, but I sort of insist on that. Of course, sometimes it can be used in a plural context. So comics is a medium. And then there are many different formats of comics. So one format is the comic strip, which was sort of invented in an American context in the 1890s in, sensational newspapers in New York City published by Hearst and Pulitzer. Mm-hmm. There's the comic book, which was really popularized in 1938 with the first issue of Action Comics, which is the first appearance of a superhero. Mm-hmm. Then there are formats like the graphic novel and webcomics. So comics is a medium, and there are all sorts of different iterations of comics.
Like many people, much of my first reading, and it was very passionate reading, was comic books, and obviously comic strips in the daily paper I was always keeping up with. And yet now, obviously I think people think first of graphic novels in the sort of literary sense of comics. And I wonder, why and how did this become taken so seriously as a genre in terms of, now we have people reviewing these things and writing these books who are taking part in basically the broader literary tradition rather than
absolutely,
more entertainment sort of focused.
Well, I'm so pleased that you think graphic novels are what people think of when they think of comics, because I feel like for years and years that I've been thinking about comics and talking to people about comics. When I tell them what I study and think about, they often think I mean superhero comics. So
Right.
if you think that, I'm really pleased, because that means there's a real shift happening, and I think my book is trying to participate in that shift. But, one of the things comics has contended with for so long is the fact that people mistake the whole medium for its most popular genre, which is superheroes.
And Garfield.
And Garfield. I love Garfield.
Yeah, not that there's anything wrong with Garfield. Let's not.
Do you know that Garfield is translated into Russian? It's actually the most widely circulating, published, and translated strip, except for Charles Schultz's Peanuts.
Wow, that's fantastic. Well, the
anyway,
world is doing something right.
Yes, I know, Garfield in Russian. But I think the real shift started to happen in the 1950s and in the 1960s. Because
that long ago.
the psychiatrist Frederick Wertham published his best-selling book called Seduction of the Innocent in 1954. This was chronicled very beautifully by David Haydu in his book 10 Cent Plague from a number of years ago. And this basically shuttered a whole portion of the comics industry, like horror comics, violent comics, suspense comics. So what had happened was Wertham had published this book about, the violence of comics and their links to real-world violence and crime. There were Senate hearings around this issue that led to a censorship code for comics. And it had very overzealous stipulations, such as, like, in all instances shall good triumph over evil. Can you imagine how many interesting stories can be published with that stipulation? So what happened in that moment after the mid-1950s is that satire thrived, like Mad Magazine. And satire developed a very sophisticated idiom in comics. So this whole notion of, comedy today and satire today, sort of like we're part of the news media and the news media is lying to you, like Jon Stewart and Colbert. This, in my mind, and Art Spiegelman has said this too, sort of really comes from Mad Magazine, which was very self-conscious about media aesthetics in a very savvy way. As Spiegelman has said, postmodernism avant la lettre. And then what also happened, and this is related to this whole satire movement, is that cartoonists basically went underground. They couldn't publish interesting work in the above-ground venues because of the Comics Code. So, inspired and really galvanized by the left-wing press and, the anti-war counterculture of the 60s, a huge underground comic scene started thriving in New York and San Francisco mostly, but really all across the country. And you had people suddenly, for the first time, experimenting with comics form and experimenting with content in a way they had never been able to have done with commercial strictures. And
then what about graphic novels themselves? Because I know that a lot of that, in terms of the leftist press, were sort of strips and political strips and things like that. And then what is the arc of how we got to the point where the graphic novel industry is so thriving and there's such wide interest in it?
The very first book that had the words "a graphic novel" on the cover was Will Eisner's book A Contract with God, which was published in 1978.
And Eisner claims to have coined this term.
Well, he claims to have made it up on the spot in a bid to sell his book to a mainstream publisher because he wanted his book to be in bookstores. He didn't want it to be in specialty shops. He wanted it to be with the other novels. So he claims that he made it up on the spot, but there have been other usages of it, so I think he didn't claim that he was the very first person.
He just didn't know of it yet.
Yeah. But I actually think that the work called, this is kind of a mouthful, Binky Brown Meets the Holy Virgin Mary, which is a 44-page comic book from 1972, might qualify in my mind, if I'm thinking of substance and not just claiming taxonomy, as the first graphic novel. It was one of the very first underground works to have that length. So it was one story front to back between two floppy comics covers. So it was a single-story comic book. And it was, in fact, the very first autobiographical work published in comics form.
And we should say that as much as graphic novels have become a very seriously taken format, and we joked about Garfield earlier, but there have been strips that, because of the fact that they appeared in leftist press and they took on social issues, had big impacts on people and social change. I'm thinking about Alison Bechdel in particular. She's very famous now for Fun Home and her other current works, but let's talk for a minute about Dykes to Watch Out For.
The story of Alison Bechdel's career is the sort of classic story that my book is trying to highlight with this theme I have, which is why comics, from underground to everywhere. Alison Bechdel went to Oberlin College, and then she applied to art school, and she didn't get in to any art schools. So she likes to joke that, she got her education on the streets.
I imagine she's getting some honorary degrees now.
Oh, yeah. So, she and I gave a talk together at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago a few years ago, which was a school that had rejected her as a student, back in the early 80s. So I think she's getting a kick out of that. But she published the first installment of Dykes to Watch Out For in an underground feminist newspaper called Woman News. That's one word, Woman News, run together, in 1983. And this was a feminist publication that she was volunteering at doing production work. So you see that these small left-of-center publications like Woman News, become the venues for completely terrain-shifting work like Dykes to Watch Out For. So it started off as a single-panel cartoon strip, and one of the things that I find very touching about it is that she numbered them in the early days of Dykes to Watch Out For. So the very first one is actually numbered, Dykes to Watch Out For number 27, but it was the first one. So she's sort of implying that there's this long chain of dykes, to be concretized on the page and to be revealed, and she's just sort of coming in the middle. And part of what she said she was trying to do was to create a visual culture that she didn't actually have yet. So she said when she moved to New York City after college, she was hungry to see visual images of people like her, which is to say, lesbians and butch lesbians. And she couldn't really find it anywhere. So she went out and she created that culture for herself. And Dykes to Watch Out For, at its height, was syndicated in 60 newspapers across the country. So it's a really moving story of sort of working from the ground up and becoming a person who's really shaping contemporary culture. Now, in 2006, she published Fun Home, which had a crossover audience in the way Dykes to Watch Out For never had. But Dykes to Watch Out For is a really important work in terms of sort of shaping a sense of gay community and visual culture in the 80s and 90s and 2000s.
Let's talk briefly about a less fun subject, which is disaster. And I'm thinking in particular about Art Spiegelman and his role in the history of comics. And also there's this very interesting and arresting full-page illustration in the book, which is the cover of The New Yorker 2 weeks after September 11th, which many of our listeners probably remember was sort of a very charcoal gray cover with very dark black outlines of the towers on it. Can you talk about his role both in kind of the subjects that comics were willing to take on and then how comics have addressed very, very serious global issues?
In my mind, there is no more influential cartoonist in terms of thinking about how the graphic novel came to be the field it is today than Art Spiegelman. So Art Spiegelman's Mouse, the first volume, came out in 1986. It had earlier, as I think not as many people might know, been serialized in the magazine called Raw, which was published by Spiegelman and his wife, Françoise Mouly, and was initially self-published. Françoise Mouly dragged a 2,000-pound used printing press into their Soho loft, and they printed the early issues of Raw in their home, which is the home they still live in. But the fact that Spiegelman took on this serious a story in comics unflinchingly and claimed comics as a form that could not only sort of join other forms in revealing disaster, but actually add something to the whole idea of how to represent an event as traumatic as the Holocaust, was just a huge, huge, huge ground-shifting moment. So
how much was that ground-shifting moment recognized at the time?
It was recognized pretty quickly. I don't think that Pantheon, which published and continues to publish Spiegelman realized when Mouse 1 came out in 1986 just how big of a splash it would make. I think they thought it would sort of be a succès d'estime, but I don't think they thought it would be, one of their best-selling titles of all time. So it was a real phenomenon. Something that happened sort of along the way that was really fascinating was that back when Mouse was still being serialized in Raw magazine, a fairly low print run, fairly esoteric magazine. It had, maybe a print run of about 5,000 at that point, but it was very popular among sort of avant-garde readers. Ken Tucker published a piece actually in the New York Times, I think it was in the book review, about Spiegelman's Mouse, saying that it was an exceptional work. And it was so unusual because he was publishing a review of a work in progress, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think rarely happens.
Yes, never as far as I know.
Right, yeah, never that I've known besides this. He was also publishing a review about a comics work, which in the 80s was pretty rare. And he was publishing a review about a comics work in progress, basically in an underground magazine, which seemed really rare too. And so I think at that moment, Pantheon sort of got wind of the idea that maybe they had something very special on their hands.
Well, this is a very wide-ranging subject, as I said, and a wide-ranging book, and we could talk about the individual questions it raises for a long time, but I'm going to put you on the spot here at the end, and because every week we talk about what some of us here at the Book Review are reading, and since this is a book meant to sort of inspire some people who maybe aren't as familiar with the genre, if they read your book and they want to read something else that's current, what are one or two things you've read recently that you really enjoyed?
I would highly recommend Chris Ware's book Monograph, which just came out. Chris Ware is a person who I write about in Y Comics, and he actually comes up in two chapters. He comes up in the chapter on superheroes and in the chapter on suburbs. So he's a well-attended to figure in my book. And this incredible book that just came out, Monograph, it's an oversized book, is a sort of collection compendium of his work since the 1980s. And in my mind, he's really one of the top people shaping the field, and importantly, doing it in a bunch of different venues. So people might know his work from the covers of The New Yorker, where he is a very frequent cover contributor. But his book, Jimmy Corrigan, which was published in the year 2000, also really shifted up comics culture. It's sort of a milestone, along with Mouse coming out in 1986. It came out in 2000. It won the Guardian First Book Award, where it was up against prose books like Zadie Smith's White Teeth, and won in that category. So sort of as with Spiegelman, Ware has enacted these terrain-shifting moments for comics, and one of his more recent terrain-shifting moments for comics was the publication in 2012 of his book Building Stories, which is a book in a box.
Yeah. And I believe was one of our 10 best books that year, which was also a sort of terrain-shifting decision.
Yes, it was. And I remember when this book was about to come out because, I was living in Chicago and talking to Chris Ware about it. I wasn't sure how well this book would land. I figured that I would love it. But, it costs $50.
Yeah.
And it's a box, and it has 14 different sized pieces in it. So he really took a risk there, and it paid off, which is sort of one of the themes of my book in terms of profiling these different cartoonists. So Pantheon actually ran out of its first print run very quickly, and it was reprinted. So it was more of a success than anybody thought, and it made all sorts of best of lists. And it also really changed the way people think about graphic novels as books that inhabit themselves materially, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. No, it's definitely an object more than a book.
Definitely an object. And I feel like this is one of the major things that graphic novels bring to the table in this era where everybody is sort of worrying about the decline of print. I feel like all of the graphic novels I write about in Y Comics, and Chris's in particular, just by existing are sort of like manifestos for print culture. They really show that the book is an object. They can't be easily reflowed for the digital at all, right? I mean, Building Stories literally can't be.
Yeah.
It's a box with 14 objects in it that you can read in any order that you want, and for which there is no true reading order, right? It's really up to the reader to build the story, as the title suggests.
Well, here is to print in newspapers and in books and in boxes. The book, again, is Why Comics From Underground to Everywhere by Hillary Chute, and it is reviewed on our cover this week by Manola Dargis. Hillary, thanks again.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it.
This is John Williams, and I'm joined this week by my colleagues Jennifer Salai, Gal Beckerman, and Greg Coles to talk about what we're reading. Hey, guys.
Hi, John.
Hey. Hi, John.
Greg, you want to start to my left?
Sure. I am reading an American writer that I've never read before, but he's got a very big reputation, and I feel like he's fallen a little bit out of style. That is Wallace Stegner, and I'm reading what's considered his masterpiece, Angle of Repose, which is a big kind of family epic set in the frontier days, although it's framed in and out. It's narrated by a guy in the late 1960s, a retired history professor who's in a wheelchair, divorced, and you get his family story and his relationship with his kids as it goes throughout. But really, he is narrating the story of his grandparents and their trip out west. And it's a very kind of stately, majestic, Western-feeling novel, lots of wide open spaces, lots of landscape, which, of course, is what Stegner is famous for. It's a book that puts me a bit in mind of Carol Shields' Stone Diaries or the novel Stoner by John Williams. In that
sweeping look at an American life.
Yeah, and kind of this documentary feel.
Right, right.
It's also got a very Ken Burns kind of sepia tint to it.
Slow motion pan across the page as you read. Jen, what about you?
So last week, a writer that I was very much fond of, William Gass, died at the age of 93. And he's somebody who...
You had worked with him.
I had worked with him several times when I was at Harper's Magazine. And, I think when I started working with him, he was already 80. I mean, he was already up there in years, but he was always incredibly sharp. He wrote several essays for the review section at Harper's. And I decided that I would try to start again a book that I never finished by him, Omensetter's Luck. And I think I'm failing again at Omensetter's Luck. I mean, the sentences are just incredible. The writing...
He writes with such music.
He writes with music. I mean, the sentences are also very lucid, so it's just more the way that everything fits together.
I started this book many, many years ago because I think David Foster Wallace spoke highly of it in some interview or something, like really highly of it. And I thought, I'll try. And there was something about the sentences not really making sense one after the other. I felt very underwater.
Right.
I bailed pretty quick.
I think he sort of expects everything to just sort of wash over the reader, and then you just sort of get a sense of the environment that you're in.
What's it about? Ostensibly.
It's ostensibly about a preacher in 1890s Ohio.
Okay.
And that's as much as I sort of have gotten into. But, it does end with this incredible afterword, at least the 1997, I think it's the 97 edition, the Penguin Classics edition. And then I was also dipping into some of his essays, and he had put out several really sublime collections, and this one is Life Sentences, which I think might have been the last essay collection he put out in 2012. And, he was a philosophy professor for a while, too. I mean, that's what he studied, and like David Foster Wallace, I guess, he studied this. And so he's one of these writers, I think a rare sort of writer who was just as interested in sort of deep, big existential questions as he was in just the aesthetics of a sentence.
Gal, are you reading anything deep and sublime? Come on.
I'm picking up the nonfiction side of things.
It looks like you have
here.
a press release in front of you or something.
I don't actually have the book here because I finished it last night and came in this morning not realizing I would talk about it, but it's actually quite a relevant book, I think, for the moment. It's Sarah Marcus's book, Girls to the Front, which is a history of the Riot Girl movement. It was published in 2010, and it's quite an exhaustive history of what's basically this 2-year period where this small, very grassroots movement burned.
2 years?
I mean, they continued to
Okay.
exist beyond that, but basically from 92 to 94 is when Riot Grrrl had their moment and birthed these bands, that are kind of been associated with them, Bikini Kill and Bratmobile. I was particularly interested in it at first just because I wanted to understand more about zine culture, which was at the heart of the Riot Grrrl movement. And for those of you too young to remember, zines were
not looking at me.
I was not looking at anyone around this table.
Yeah, I was gonna
Perhaps
say.
some of our listeners. Zines were these homemade magazines, that
Blogs
put together.
before blogs.
Exactly.
I guess that's true. Do people still have zines?
I think
they
they
do.
actually do. But what was interesting about this movement is it was pretty spread out, and it was all very grassroots. The two big centers were in Olympia and in Washington, D.C. And also the bands themselves, particularly Bikini Kill and Kathleen Hanna, who fronted that band, they're traveling around to kind of connect the various, hubs of this movement, which was mostly young women who would get together, who do kind of consciousness raising meetings, talk a lot about their own experiences of sexual harassment, talk about the way girls and women were depicted in the media, and try to kind of create a new culture that was not like second wave feminism. They wanted to kind of reclaim sexuality, but at the same time, part of the kind of motive for starting the movement was that a lot of these girls were in the punk scene and felt that it was, even though it was supposed to be about individuality and supposed to be different, girls weren't really allowed to really participate. So that's kind of what it came out of. And the book is very kind of, I think she spent 5 or 6 years kind of talking with everybody who was part of this. Sometimes it almost gets a little bit lost in the details of it, but you really get a sense of it. And the one thing that was quite interesting to me was kind of how it began to fall apart, which was that it got an intense amount of media attention at some point. There was some real fascination around 92, 93. And so Newsweek did a big story, and Washington Post did a big story, and they all kind of the women who were at the heart of this really felt undermined by these. They felt like they weren't really being understood, like they were being kind of
commodified.
It was concurrent with grunge, and I think it got
exactly
painted with the same
totally.
brush.
So Nirvana in the book is because they were all friends with the Nirvana guys early on.
Courtney Love in Hole is very much part of that scene.
Right. Exactly.
Grew up in Olympia.
Exactly. So they saw kind of what happened in Nirvana as kind of the negative, the negative case. And so they felt it suddenly happening to them, and there was just a lot of infighting. At one point they wanted to do kind of a media blackout where they decided they would not talk to anybody in the media. And they felt that the zines, and this is kind of where my interest in the book started, was their way of communicating with each other in a kind of...
And with their fans.
And with the bands.
Who weren't big media.
Right, and also in a way that felt honest to themselves and kind of and also captured all of the kind of the not finished quality of kind of how they saw their movement. They were trying to figure out who they were. So it was pretty cool, and it's pretty cool to read now, especially kind of as we are in a moment again where we're highlighting a lot of these issues, but they are kind of coming to light in these big media ways and not at the grassroots level, which I think was their main modus operandi. They really wanted to improve themselves and kind of find ways to kind of strengthen their own identities.
John, what have you been reading besides Cat Person?
Just finished it this morning. I was maybe the last person on earth.
We have a limited amount of time here today, and I'm actually going to be quick because partly because I'm sure people don't want to hear much more about Cormac McCarthy, but I'm reading Outer Dark, which is the second of his first 3 novels and the third that I'm reading on this little jaunt I'm on, and it continues on the sunny side of the street. It's about a pair of incestuous siblings who live deep in the woods together. The woman gives birth to a baby as a result of this relationship. The man takes the baby and leaves it in the woods, and the baby is picked up by someone else, and the woman sort of figures out that this is what happened and goes off in search of the baby. Very dark, but very, very clearly written, compared to some of his other earlier books. And I am, again, quote unquote, enjoying it. But even I am a little bit, you can only take so much. So I also decided this week to read something else alongside it, which I won't talk about because you guys have all read it recently and talked about it on the podcast, which is Elif Bachman's The Idiot, which is a delightful, very amusing and very, very smart on every page novel about a woman at Harvard in her freshman year and dealing with the intellectual and social anxieties of that. And I think it's something that I was thinking the other day that it's something that fans of Lady Bird, the movie, would like. And then I saw Greta Gerwig mention in a list the next day that The Idiot is one of her 10 favorite books. So those are my 2. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Thank you, John.
Remember, there's always more online at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado of Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.